Hello YouTube friends, this is the Chess Total channel and I'm going to show you a really cool game, Magnus Carlsen versus Gukesh, and they're now becoming the biggest rivalry in chess. They played the Blitz tournament recently at the Chess Grand Tour in Croatia. And now I'm going to show you this game which featured Magnus Carlsen's revenge. After that episode where he slammed the table hard and lost to Gukesh, now Magnus manages to get his revenge on Gukesh. I'm going to show you this game. It was truly beautiful. And look, we start here now with the A standard opening, right? The king's pawn opening. We play knight to f3. Gukesh responds and Magnus goes for the Ruy Lopez. Yes, the Ruy Lopez is very solid, and here Gukesh played this variation that guys many say is an anti Ruy Lopez, right? Why is that? Well, it's attacking this pawn, so if you castle you have to step a bit outside the traditional Ruy Lopez lines. And then Magnus comes in and already defends this central pawn. Look, Gukesh develops the center, right? Develops a piece and already puts pieces in the center. This knight is already targeting here. This knight is already attacking this pawn. So, in other words, Gukesh's development is always very good. And Magnus also already has a defended center, pieces in the center, and this bishop already developed in a typical Ruy Lopez position. Magnus comes in and brings another piece into play, develops the other knight, and Gukesh castles, putting his king in safety. Up to this point, everything is normal. Magnus, look at this. He goes for this line that's not very common. He takes his knight, meaning he gives up his pair of bishops. There's another video on the channel where I mentioned that giving up the pair of bishops isn't a good idea unless you have some compensation. But we're going to see why Magnus does this here. Gukesh captures with this pawn, right? So as not to open the filetto, keep the pawn structure less vulnerable, right? Because if he did it the other way, he'd end up with three, right? Three pawn island zone here, another here, and then this one, which is a bad idea, it's a weakness. Meanwhile, Magnus has only one pawn island that can still be connected, so it would be much worse. While Gukesh now has two pawn islands, Magnus has only one pawn island. Look at that. Oops. Magnus has this pawn island here. This is very strong. Magnus always pays attention to pawn structure. In the long run, you'll see that this is important. So Magnus develops his bishop, right, which is the piece he still needs to develop, and places it in the center. Gukesh doesn't exchange this bishop, keeping it on the board, and Magnus pins this knight over here, effectively immobilizing it, all right, permitting no escape. Yeah, blocking it, pinning it so it absolutely cannot move from its current square. So he pushes the knight away. Look, you have to move from there, or I'll take it. Magnus retreats, keeping the knight pinned, and then Gukesh makes his first mistake here. It's not a huge blunder, but, you know, Kasparov used to say that this kind of mistake is one where you're actually helping your opponent with the white pieces, because when you make the move Magnus just did, you're pinning, you're removing it, you already wanted to do this. In many situations, you already wanted to do this, and he just helped you accomplish it. You did this without losing a single tempo, right? And then, instead of him going back here and you playing Luke, guys, instead of him coming here and you playing and doing what you wanted, already launching a pawn avalanche against his king, he was forced to capture. And so that small long-term advantage that Gukesh would have had with the bishop pair, he now has to give it back to Magnus. All right? And he brings this bishop back here because of the pin that the bishop put on the knight. Magnus captures this knight, right? The bishop takes, and here Magnus makes a really nice move. This move by Magnus is prophylactic. He's anticipating some things ahead and planning how he's going to attack. In other words, he wants to push these pawns forward, but he can't come here. If he makes these two moves, he allows Gukesh to come in and start making some plans to attack Magnus' center. When he makes this move, he keeps the whole structure just as it is. Perfect here. Look, this entire perfect pawn island of Magnus. He maintains this small advantage he has and plays a prophylactic move so he can do this later. Right? Gukesh moves his queen to connect the rooks, and Magnus makes his move. Look, He made the move taking away space from Gukesh's bishop, which now has no move to this side and is forced to go back. All right, everyone. And now, let's see now, Magnus needs to figure out exactly which move he's going to make. And he castles just when you think Magnus is going to castle to the other side, when you wonder, what is Magnus going to do? Move the king over here, try to gain more space. He goes and castles on the same side where Gukesh's attack is positioned. You might say, what's this? Didn't Magnus think about that? Calm down, everyone. He fought through all of this. I'm sure he must have thought 10, 20 moves ahead, analyzed the pawn structure, everything before making this move. And then Gukesh, all right, immediately pins this pawn over here. So later on, he doesn't allow ideas like f4, expanding and putting the rook on open files. Magnus gets out of this bishop pin and at the same time creates space for this rook to come in later on. Gukesh improves the bishop's position a bit, setting up ideas like, for example, if he captures. So Magnus is going to end up, remember that pawn island I told you was really strong? If he takes here, Magnus ends up with an isolated pawn here and then this pawn island over there. In other words, Magnus did, and Gukesh, actually Magnus isn't going to allow that because his structure is really solid. He's not going to allow that. If Gukesh takes here, which he didn't do, Magnus could play, and after Gukesh moves his bishop, right? If he brought the bishop back here or here, Magnus would bring his rook to the 7th rank. That's why he pulled back and didn't take this pawn here. Look, and now Magnus is going to start advancing this pawn chain slowly. So here, look, he prepared everything calmly and now he pushes forward. And look how this area is already dominated. He's already starting to advance with the king's pawns. Gukesh prepares an escape route for his king here, sets up a counterattack. Yeah, against Magnus. And then Magnus brings in another piece now, which was over here on this side in a pretty bad position, right? It couldn't do anything. He improves the position of his knight and is already preparing to enter these squares over here. Magnus places a piece, right? Attacking here. Oops. Gukesh played and now Magnus sets up a defense and puts a rook on a file that could be opened. All right, everyone. The only rook Gukesh had that wasn't active was this one. So he brings the rook into the game, expecting to open up this file later on. And then Magnus expands. Look, he lost control of this file here, right? And with the possibility to expand, Magnus goes ahead and gains some space. Guys, the way Magnus plays is really beautiful because you see whole game is focused on this side here. And this move where he comes and plays this pawn to a4, it's a moment where he breaks away from everything he's been doing and shifts the play to the other side. He switches and moves to the queen side. That's really incredible what he does. Because at that moment he could have been thinking about something here or, I don't know, a pawn over here. But no, he switches and manages to gain space on the queen side. And it's these small advantages that make Magnus so special in chess. Gukesh, seeing that he lost that space, had to do this here to also gain a little bit of space. And Magnus moves his queen away from here with the goal of later breaking through this pawn, gaining space, and being able to launch an attack. Gukesh improves the position of his rook, preparing for a possible rook doubling. All right, everyone. And now Magnus plays with the intention of going straight for the attacking king. The king comes over, defends here now, and is already on a better square than before. And Magnus doesn't wait, goes for it, breaks through without fear. What happens with this move, guys? If Gukesh takes, right? If Gukesh takes here, look what happens. Magnus delivers a fork. Of course, that's not going to happen, but he's already threatening to gain a decisive advantage, right? So obviously he can't take this pawn. Let's see what he did. He moves a queen here. Yeah, offering a queen trade. Magnus trades the queens. And here, guys, look, I want you to really pay attention to the pawn structure of both players. Magnus still has all his pawns without any weaknesses. Gukesh has doubled pawns, right? Now he has, yeah, two pawn islands, right? This island here and this island here of pawns. So Magnus is managing to get these small advantages, and now it's time for him to maneuver his knight. Oops. He's going to maneuver his knight to get a better position, because where it is now, it's not doing anything anymore. Gukesh brings his rook over already too. Look, the objective is very clear. Here, the bishop is aiming. He wants to come down here and check Magnus, and that's going to cause some trouble. Magnus responds and lifts up. Of course, he gave more freedom to Gukesh's bishop, but that bishop can't really do much. Sure, it has a bit more freedom, but it can't make much progress. Magnus comes in and pins this rook here because, well, he expands, wants a future expansion, and Magnus's knight can't attack this point. It's very hard for him to reach these squares here. These are the squares to attack this rook. Alright, guys. So Magnus captures, opening up right his rook's file, and Gukesh captures, fixing now with 3 pawn islands. I'm always going to talk to you about these pawn islands. Now he has 3 pawn islands, 2 double pawns, and that's really bad. That's really bad. Always analyze your pawn islands. Magnus comes and defends this square because it was being attacked by both rooks here, right? Both rooks were targeting this pawn, and now Gukesh offers this rook exchange. Now guys, here he made a serious mistake because Magnus is going to consider whether to trade or not. And it's like I told you, let's look at the pawn structures. You always have to look at the pawn structure in your games. That's something you need to analyze. Magnus has only 1 pawn island, but why is that so strong? Because in the endgame, 1 pawn protects the other. When a pawn is far from another, in this case a double pawn, you disrupt your pawn's defenses. There's no way to defend it. Who's going to defend this pawn here, guys? Who's going to defend this pawn here? No one? This pawn here, for example, let's suppose it's in a pawn chain. This pawn protects the other. So if you, let's say, protect this one, this pawn here, logically you're also protecting this one. This pawn here has no one. That's why the pawn chain is so important, because a pawn, since it's very weak, 1 pawn protects the other, and creating several pawn chains messes up your structure. Magnus observed, and of course he captured here while analyzing Gukesh's pawn chain. Gukesh captured and made his king's situation worse, and Magnus goes for the idea, the winning idea, which is to come over here and try to attack this isolated pawn. Gukesh, of course, isn't going to allow that. He tries to give some activity to his rook, which was stuck here doing nothing, and already starts to attack. Now is a really good moment, because Magnus has put, well, 2 slave pieces into the game. What happens? This bishop has to stay here because it's defending this pawn, and this rook is here. So he has 2 pieces that aren't doing anything, they're just protecting the pawns. So what does Magnus do? He already prepares an expansion to put his rook into action. Gukesh says, no, hold on, if you're coming here to try to open things up, I'll protect this square. So what does Magnus do? He gives a check to see where the king will go, whether he'll go here or somewhere else. His king improves a little, and Gukesh brings his king toward the center of the board. Gukesh brings this bishop over here to try to defend, to try something to expand these pawns. And Magnus, simply going against everyone, including the commentators at the time, takes this pawn. Because the structure is very closed, if Magnus keeps working little by little, he can win, he can pull it off. Gukesh is going to do this here to try to open things up. When Gukesh makes this move, this pawn push, he's going to deliver a discovered attack on the king. And that's going to open up the game for him. Look, we have to analyze 2 things here. We're seeing knight versus bishop. What's better for the knight? Closed positions. And for the bishop, open positions. When Magnus takes this here, it looks like Magnus made a mistake because he's opening up the position for Gukesh. But no, guys, Magnus had already calculated everything. All this pawn weakness, he had already calculated it, and he knew that even in this position, he wanted to simplify these pawns and go for a winning endgame. Gukesh, of course, gives this discover check only because it's a mistake. Magnus's king automatically improves. Gukesh takes this pawn, and Magnus brings his king in. Gukesh checks Magnus's king. Magnus improves his king's position. Gukesh attacks the knight, and look, Magnus takes another pawn. Gukesh takes this pawn from Magnus, and what happens? We have to notice the following. Magnus captured the pawn from the second rank, from the B file, and Gukesh captured the pawn from the A file. Which one is more valuable? Guys, the more central a pawn is, the more valuable it is. In other words, a B-file pawn in theory in general terms is more valuable than an A-file pawn. Magnus trades a slight advantage of the B-file pawn for an A-file pawn, right? Magnus defends. Gukesh tries to give his rook some mobility. Magnus Carlsen brings his rook to the open file. Gukesh gives a check. The king hides and makes room for the pawn to advance. Gukesh places his bishop, pinning the rook and blocking, right? And already allowing a check and some tactics here. Magnus obviously brings the rook over for this defense and improves his position. He brings the king into the game and Magnus drives this bishop away. Now the bishop has to move. Gukesh moves the bishop to the f2 square and Magnus infiltrates on the 7th rank, just as Nimzovich says. Look how cool this is, guys. Gukesh makes a mistake, and now we're already at the end. Magnus has checkmate by bringing the knight here, see? And then checkmate with the rook here. But Magnus already didn't even need to. Magnus has 2 minutes, and Gukesh has 3 minutes, 3 seconds. And here Magnus simply takes this pawn, ignoring the checkmate, right? He didn't even need to go for the forced checkmate. And here Gukesh resigns because we have 3 connected pawns against 3 pawns on this side, except 2 of them are doubled. And here we have 2 passed and connected pawns that will easily win this game. So in this incredible game by Magnus Carlsen, with just a few small advantages, he managed to convert it into this amazing victory against Gukesh. And that's it. I want you to tell me what you thought of this game. If you enjoyed this match, write here in the comments what you thought, who you think is the greatest in the world right now. Yeah, give it a thumbs up if you liked the video. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. I'm really happy when you give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed. And thank you so much, everyone, to all of you who watched until now. Thank you for following the channel. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much, everyone. All the best to you.